In this video, I'm going to show you how to apply the image files that we just made as textures and displacements in Rhino. So here we are in Rhino with the object that we want to apply the texture and displacements to. I'm in the shaded view, and let's start by applying applying one of our textures as a material. And so we're going to do this by selecting the object, and you need to have properties pulled up. And we're going to make a new material for the object, and we're just going to use a Rhino material. So you may have V-Ray pulling up, but we actually want to use a Rhino material. And instead of layer material, we're going to click Use New Material. So come to the pull down here, get Use New Material, and we're not doing a V-Ray material if you have V-Ray installed. We're going to use a custom Rhino material. And let's change this to, we'll start with plastic red. That will be the name of our material. And here I am going to, under color, I could choose Assign Texture. I could also come down to Texture and click this checkbox here to assign the texture. Let's do it that way. Under Color, click to Assign Texture, and then it's going to pull up a folder. I'm browsing to the folder where I have Plastic Tile Red. And I'm going to open that up, and here you can see that we have that plastic image being applied to the object. Now, you may not see this in the shaded view by default. I have my shaded view set up so that rendered textures like image files will display. So you may have to, in Rhino, come up to the pull down here and select rendered, and then you should be able to see the texture. You can see that the texture is streaking quite a lot in certain parts of the image, and this has to do with how it's being applied. It's probably being applied either as a box or as a surface that's just like kind of shooting through the image. So I'm going to select the object, and we can change the way that the texture is being mapped to it. So next to the material icon is the texture mapping icon. I'm going to click this, and since this object has a roughly spherical shape, that's going to be probably the best shape to use. So if I come down here, I can look at all of these different icons. I'm going to click Apply Spherical Mapping. Now it's going to ask for some, it's going to prompt you to specify some things here. I'm just going to accept the defaults. You could play around with this and locate the center of the sphere in a different spot. You could really control how that's being applied. But in this case, I'm just going to pick Bounding Box, and then I'm going to accept the coordinate system world and hit Enter. And now it's applying the texture in a much more even way. So we're not getting those weird streaks. Now you will see that it does pinch at the pole of the top of the imaginary, or the sphere that's being used to project the texture. So it's not perfect, but we're going to live with this for the purposes of the tutorial. And okay, so this is how we see the texture on the object. But you can see that there's no displacement yet, right? So how do we apply the displacement? To show you the displacement, I'm going to temporarily turn the texture off of this guy. So going back to Object, Material here, I'm going to put it back to the default material. So now we're just seeing a flat gray color. And now I'm going to come over to Displacement. So I have to assign a texture first, and I'm going to click here, the the arrow, create a new texture, and there are some built-in things that you could play around with here, like granite textures, dots, etc. But I'm going to use our bitmap texture. So I'm going to select bitmap texture, and I am going to go to plastic tile bump. That was the black and white image that we created. So hitting OK. Now I'm going to turn this on, and I'm not seeing much to begin with. You can see there's something happening here when I click it on. It goes a little bit more gray here. I need to do a couple of things here. One is I need to increase the value of the white point down here. So right now it's 1. I'm going to set this to 5. And now you can see that I'm getting much more displacement. And as I make this value bigger, I could go out like to 10, for example. It's getting more aggressively displaced. And if I do something like 100, it should really, right, so it really kind of shoots out, right? Now our, oops, now it's starting to displace again. I didn't mean to change this. It's taking a minute for my computer to render it. Okay. I can also change the density of the displacement mesh. So I'm going to take this down to medium, and I'm going to take my white point back to something more reasonable, like maybe not 50, maybe 20. Okay, that's pretty textured. And let's also look at the black point. So basically the white point, as you make this value bigger, it's pushing the displacement out further. If we, by default, the black point is 0, but if we make it -20, it's going to pull the black areas of the image in more. So you can pull the image, you can pull the displacement in using the black point of the image, and you can push it out using the white point of the image. So we could say we want the black point to be, you can also puff it out, right? But I'm going to make this -10. And so now I have a black point of -10 and a white point of 20, and I get this very, very faceted object. Now, by default, it was set to 0 and 1. Oops, I just set it to 0 and 120. 0 and 1, and you can see that I don't really see anything happening. So you'll have to play around with these settings to get something interesting. Now I could set, let's see, have the black point at -10 and the white point at 20. Okay, cool. If I wanted to invert the image, I could go back into Photoshop and make a new one where I invert the black and white. Or here, I could make the black point 20 and the white point -10 and flip the way that it's working. So I'm just going to revert it back to 20 and -10. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now there are some other things that we can do here. We can under the mesh detail settings, the initial quality will probably be set to medium, but we can also change this to high, and you can see now that I've changed it to high, we're seeing even more detail. Now there is a seam in this image, and it's creating some a kind of interesting error here, and also it's, you can see that pinch around the poles. You have to play around with the images if you want it to be super seamless, but for what we're doing, it's probably not so important. So this is looking pretty cool. So let's see what happens if we go to very high. You could stall out your computer, exceed its memory, but it's working on it right now. Should I pause this? No, it popped in. So now we're seeing even more sort of stuff here. So I'm going to take this back. So this is looking very geologic at this point. And I'm going to take this back down to medium. And right now this is just the displacement. And again, as I explained in the intro video, if I want to save a copy of this as mesh geometry, I can use the command in Rhino, extract render mesh. And there we go. Now we may also be, oops, this is the render mesh, this is the object. That's the displacement is being applied to. Now, under mesh, render mesh, there should be mesh. Do we see, oh, render mesh properties, right? So we don't really need to look at that because the command for extracting the render mesh is not there. So I'm not sure if there's a place to get to that in the pull down, but you can always type extract render mesh. So now I've got this guy displaced, I've got this guy extracted from the displaced mesh. I'm going to make a copy, and as I showed you before, I can reduce this mesh, and right now it's 18,000 polygons and change. I could take it down to something like 50. And it's reducing the mesh. Let me pause it for a second while it's reducing. Okay. So this is the object that was produced once I moved this, reduced this from 18,000 polygons to 50. So then you could apply the displacement to this and so on. Again, I want to weld the vertices of this because by default I could explode it. So weld vertices, select the whole thing, then I've got this, and I can try rebuilding the mesh normals, and that's going to make it look clearer. You won't get so much strange shading on it. So we could do something interesting with this as well. Now, if we want to apply the texture to this, I could go back to not texture mapping but material and use the plastic red color, and then I have this applied. And you know, with the seaming of this image, actually, one thing that I didn't really look at, just to make sure, let me take this back to the default material. This could be important because when I look at this texture, how is the displacement being applied? It's probably being applied because we set up the texture and then applied a mapping channel to it, right? We have this spherical mapping channel, and it's probably mapping channel 1. And so if I click multiple, so if I click on multiple mapping channels, we can see here that there is this mapping channel spherical that we set up for the texture, and it's channel 1. And that got assigned by default when we were setting up the bump map. However, if you're setting up when we're setting up the displacement, but if you're setting up the displacement first, you'll also want to assign the map that's appropriate for the object, right? So for example, if I'm doing a cube, here, let's see if where's that? So let me just go ahead and turn on wireframe so I can see where I am. Oh, I've been copying these things up. That's why I was so confused. There we go. Here's a box, and go back to shaded mode, and sorry, not shaded mode, but rendered mode. Okay, cool. Now let's apply the displacement to him. Now I'm already going to have a displacement in available because I've applied it to another object. So I could create a new displacement, or I can just use the one that I have here, and I'm applying it to this guy. The mapping channel is 1. Let's see what happens but we really, for this guy, we don't have a mapping channel. So let's create a new one over here in texture mapping. Let's apply a box mapping. And I'm just going to hit enter to just to accept the defaults, and that should just create. And we get the mapping channel for the box mapping. We're going to change. It's by default going to be 1. That's fine. enter. Okay, cool. So now we have a box mapping on this object. We can go back to displacement. Mapping channel 1 is actually going to mean something. And now let's see what happens if we change this white point to 40. Why aren't we seeing any? Why aren't we seeing anything here? Is it not on? Maybe it's not on. I have to turn it on. That helps. There we go. Okay, cool. Now we're seeing this box mapping. And we could set this to 20, set it to 10. Okay, now we're not seeing the seams quite so much. But there is the issue of the edges of this box. So those are going to show up more clearly the more we exaggerate the texture. So let's go -5 here, pull that in. So there we go, cool, not so bad, right? Now what happens if we apply a spherical texture to this? I'm just curious, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. So let's go to texture mapping, we'll apply a spherical mapping, hit the enter to accept the defaults. And then spherical mapping is now, if we look at the texture mapping for this object, channel 1 is box, channel 2 is spherical. We're going to come over to the displacement and change the mapping channel from 1 to 2. Okay, not quite as successful. We see that kind of polar pinch here, and then there's a seam here. Although maybe this is more interesting. If we hit this, start exaggerating this, it's giving us this sort of unexpected fissure here, which is kind of cool. So let's now make a new texture for this guy. So I'm going to come over to the, when I mean texture, I mean material. So let's create a new material, and we'll call it custom. Again, under color, I can come here, assign a texture, and look at the images of these things. I can see them. So let's use our this plastic tile pink. That one could be so that one's kind of interesting. So now we have this very kind of speckled plasticky looking thing. And again, the texture mapping for this material, let's see if we can change it. This is set to box. I could set this to, so the channel, can we assign which channel it's using? Maybe it just uses the one that's assigned to the object by default. Okay, but here we have this color now on the object. Now we could do some things with this texture. If we go to the texture mapping box, let me look at this for a moment. I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so it looks like the material is using the first mapping channel, which is box. And we have the displacement right now using the second mapping channel, which is sphere, which is fine. We could make another box mapping channel if we wanted to control the displacement, to have a box for the displacement and for the texture and control them differently. But right now, let's just keep the displacement on the spherical mapping. And then because the material is mapped to the first mapping channel, we can actually control how that's being displayed, how the texture is being displayed and rendering. So by default, if we scroll down to the bottom, you can see that we have a UVW repeat of 1, 1, and 1. And this is controlling the tiling repetition of the image. So we could change this to, if we change this to 5, what you'll see is that in the U direction, it's we get more of a grain. So it's repeating it 5 times instead of just stretching it once. If we made that 0.5, what you're going to see is that in one direction, it's going to be stretched more. So let's change this to like 25 and see. So you can see that we're getting a lot of linear stretching in this, not so much stretching, but the repetition, but it's creating this kind of linear combing effect because we're repeating it so many times in one direction. Now if we hit 25 in the other direction, now you can see that the texture is, it's like less noticeable, right? We have to really zoom in to see it. And that's because, and we can kind of see actually the boundaries of the texture. So it's not perfectly seamless, but also, you know, we'll start to see the patterns of the texture repeating over and over again, just because there's a limited image area, right? But we can do some interesting things with this, right? By, we could like change the grain of the texture by pulling it in one direction versus the other. So if I stretch it more in one direction, then I can, the image is going to be different, or the object will appear different. So then, so we have some different options for rendering it. So if I have a 10 in the, let's see if, I don't know that W will do anything. W's not doing anything. So it's just U and V. And so let's see if we, it seems like it's looking better if we stretch it in the U direction. And let's see what 50 does. That's kind of interesting, but I like 25. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. And again, we can, if we go back to our material, we can swap this out pretty quickly. So if we go to color, we're down to texture, textures, color. We can click this. We're going to get the material here, and then we can look at what happens if we swap it out for something else. So I'm going to change that image file to, let's say, the green one. And now we have the green one applied. And then let's look at what happens if we take the blended one, pick the blended one. Here's the blended one. Okay, and that gives us an interesting kind of striping, right? And that has to do with the repetition of the image. So if we went back to the texture mapping and changed this from 25 back to 1, okay, now you can see that we have the green appearing on one face once, right? This green spot, which is pretty cool. But now we can go back to this. Oops, I don't want to be changing any of this. Closest point and box. Okay, cool. Somehow I scrolled down in there, which I did not want to do. Okay, now if we start changing these things, I could do like 25 here, right? We get the striping in a different direction. Go back to 1, do it in 5 this direction. Do it, or let's try like 0.5. It's giving us, so we're getting a pretty harsh seam there, which could be interesting. I'm going to go back down and make this 25, and then we get that interesting sort of pinstripe of pink and green. So there's quite a lot that you can do between the texturing settings by playing around with the texturing settings and playing around with the mapping channels. So if I go back to this guy, let's look at that, and let's apply the same texture to this geometry. So go down, I could go to plastic pink. So now we've got the spherical mapping applied to this, and the we don't have any displacement, so we could easily turn on the displacement mapping. So let's go back to, oops, I need to go to properties, displacement, turn it on, pick the plastic tile bump. We're getting this kind of funny pushing out. Let's try this at 25 to see what we get. Okay, we're getting some texture on this guy. Now, let's do a couple of things here. Texture mapping, we're going to apply another spherical mapping to him. Bump, bump. Okay, cool. Now we have spherical too. So let's go ahead and Go back to displacement. Let's change the mapping channel to 2. So now we have the spherical mapping. And then channel 2 for the displacement. Now we're going to go back to texture mapping. Make sure we have spherical 1 selected. And now we can change the UV. If we only had one mapping channel, it would also change the way the displacement is being applied, which could also be interesting. So so we changed the U to 25 here on the mapping channel that's just affiliated with the texture. Now if we go back to texture mapping, where are we going? We're going to go back to the mapping channel here, go to this one, which is the second channel, and this is the one that is that the displacement is using. So if we change this to 25, now you see that we get that same sort of banding happening in the displacement itself, which is also interesting. Let's see if we reverse or kind of switch the U and V so that we could have a kind of banding of texture with the what am I trying to explain here? We have banding with the image file, which is going in one direction because of one mapping. Then we have this kind of striation happening in the other direction because of the displacement. So this is pretty interesting. So by playing with these settings, you can get a lot of different effects. And as you're thinking about making a plastic folly, which we're now, probably in many cases, for most of you, going to be designing digitally rather than physically, you could simulate plastic by using texture and displacement to help develop an interesting folly. So as you all have questions, and if if I think of things that I think would be useful for this exercise, I'll post more tutorials. But for those of you who are interested in using this technique for your design, hopefully these initial 3 videos can get you started.